Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Seth, psychologist, with Couch Commentary. When I do Couch Commentary, I just talk about something that's going on in pop culture from a psychological perspective. And today, the topic is a new Netflix series, the Ed Gein story. Specifically, it's called Monster, the Ed Gein story. And it is about a man named Ed Gein who, in 1957, was arrested in Plainfield, Wisconsin. Plainfield, Wisconsin is a very small town in central Wisconsin. And what authorities would come to find Ed Gein had done really blew the minds of not just law enforcement, but actually America. This was the 1950s, a very traditional time in America in many ways. And what they discovered was that Ed Gein had not only confessed to the killings of two women, but that actually what he had done more frequently than that was engage in actual body snatching, not only grave robbing, which is not usually taking the actual bodies from the grave, but removing bodies from multiple graves and then taking body parts and doing various things with those bodies. These are some of the things that Ed Gein did. Now, one of the things that was so horrific is that Ed Gein used the skin. That's one of the things that people know him for the most, removing skin and then accessorizing things like furniture with skin, making clothing out of skin. People had never really dreamed of anything like this. You really have to remember that Ed Gein in the 1950s, this was before The Silence of the Lambs. This was before so many of the horror movies that people have come to know today. In fact, in popular culture, the crimes of Ed Gein were so shocking that they would go on to inspire many other characters that people have come to know in film. As an example, Norman Bates in Psycho. Now, for anybody who's ever seen that movie, you know that there is a very complex mother son relationship. And by all accounts, it sounds like there was a very complex mother son relationship with Ed Gein and his mother as well. Freud would likely have had a lot to say about this relationship and a possible Oedipal complex. But Norman Bates was just one example. Another example, this went on to inspire the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In addition, Thomas Harris, who wrote The Silence of the Lambs, shared that the character Buffalo Bill was partly inspired by Ed Gein. Remember that the character, one of the things that the Buffalo Bill character did was to take skin and again to accessorize items of the human skin. And for anybody who saw that movie and of course had probably never heard of Ed Gein before, that was shocking to imagine using human skin in such a grotesque way. As I go a little further and talk about a few issues from this TV series from a psychological perspective, I just need to start with the fact that this is based on a true story. That is probably one of the most important things for people to know if they are going to watch this TV series on Netflix. This is not a documentary series. This is a fictionalized version. And yet, psychologically, there can still be a lot intact about what this TV series tried to portray. So, psychologically, let's start with diagnosis. Now, I did a lot of research in preparing for this, and the diagnosis that Ed Gein had been diagnosed with, this was done at a place called Central State Hospital by a couple of different doctors, Dr. Arndt and Dr. Schubert. The diagnosis that he was diagnosed with was schizophrenia chronic undifferentiated type. Schizophrenia, undifferentiated. All right. So there were reports that he had delusions, that he had hallucinations. What is relevant to ask psychologically is, was this individual psychopathic? Did Ed Gein display psychopathic traits? Now, there is a misconception about this. Of course, he's not alive. I was not able to identify that he had any particular psychopathic psychological tests to share any actual data to support such a diagnosis. But a lot of people have believed that he was psychopathic simply because of how grotesque and how disturbing some of the things that he did with his victims were. And yet, an individual to engage in some of those behaviors does not actually have to be psychopathic, does not actually have to show severe psychopathic traits. If somebody does have severe psychopathic traits, they will score very high on something like the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, devised by Robert Hare. But it's important to understand, though, that psychopathy, severe psychopathic traits, exist on the most severe end of even the antisocial personality spectrum. So, not only with psychopathic traits do you have the lack of remorse, the lack of empathy that you see with antisocial personality, but you even have a much more complex set of personality characteristics that can include, for example, a trait like duping delight, an individual who actually gets gratification, gets a sense of delight from duping others, conning others, exploiting others into believing something, for example. So, did Ed Gein show those types of psychopathic traits? That was never evident. In fact, by all accounts, it sounds like Ed Gein had some degree of emotional suffering, that he did have the capacity for remorse, and that he almost seemed to be tortured between these two different selves, one that was a very violent self and another that was really kind of like a scared, timid, regressed, highly underdeveloped individual. The actor who plays Ed Gein in the series, Charlie Hunnam, he does an amazing job capturing the way that Ed Gein spoke, the mannerisms, and it's really disarming. A few words to describe the way that this character in Monster spoke: extremely timid, almost terrified, nervous, hesitant, scared, almost like a little boy, really like he was holding something back, extremely restrained. This, of course, in dark contrast to the predatory, extremely violent way that he engaged in behavior with his victims. And so here again, we can see this conflict, this war between these two different states: the timid, the hesitant, the fearful, the small, the restrained, versus the aggressive, violent individual that engaged in the behaviors that he did with his victims. So I think that conflict, even an internal war, being in this constant state of sort of torture between these two selves, was likely at work. In addition, any viewer has to give a much deserved shout out to Laurie Metcalf, who plays the mother. This is an actress who gives her all in her roles, and she can access a well of complex emotions, really unlike many other actors I have found on screen working today. It is unbelievable at times to watch her in some of these scenes. She can shift in a millisecond between anger and terror and fear. And it's just remarkable to watch her. Sometimes I think, as a viewer, when I watch characters who have such demanding emotional roles, it's almost hard for me to imagine kind of how they do it. How do you go home after this? How do you go home after feeling so emotionally depleted? It reminds me just offhand of a Broadway performance that I saw many years ago of Janet McTeer in the production of Ibsen's A Doll's House, and her performance. You leave the theater after watching her do this performance, and this was a performance, Broadway actors are doing this day after day, and you think, how on earth can somebody make it to the market after a day like that, going through such intense emotions as a part of their work? But Laurie Metcalf did it. And I think it's worth just mentioning about this mother son relationship that a lot of accounts report that there was an extreme religious background of his mother, and also extreme preoccupation around morality, and that she really shielded him from socially connecting with others. In fact, he dropped out of school as a young teenager, but reportedly his mother had always discouraged him from having any friends. People on the quote unquote outside were bad, were believed to be threats. And so, one of the main words, as I start to close here today, that I think is probably important in understanding Ed Gein is isolation. Isolation. He was isolated probably in many different ways. He and his family lived on a very isolated, very large farm in the central part of Wisconsin. But the social isolation was likely what really was partly motivating a lot of his complex personality. Being isolated away from society, really, may have helped to give birth to these different fragmented parts of himself. So isolated is really important, I believe, in understanding his psychology. But ultimately, as I wrap up here, it's important to think about, well, what is the cause of such behavior? What is the cause of somebody engaging in such heinous behavior? What is the cause? And in all likelihood, when someone's behavior gets so off track psychologically, it is usually not just one factor. It is not necessarily just severe, untreated psychosis. It may be severe, untreated psychosis plus extreme social isolation. And yet, those two factors in itself may not be enough. It may be severe, untreated psychosis plus isolation plus being on the receiving end of very complex social messages about being bad versus being good that he may have received from a parent. Those three factors may be in addition to, and then you see how the list keeps getting longer. So it is very likely a mix of very severe factors that led to this behavior. I'm Dr. Seth, psychologist. You can also check out hundreds of videos I have on self-improvement topics here on my YouTube channel, Dr. Seth, psychologist.